The interconnected nature of the polycrisis is illustrated by the dynamic interactions between biophysical threats and social dysfunction. Similarly, conflict and crises are locked in a vicious feedback loop where each exacerbates the other. Increased violence has multiple interrelated causes and pervasive interconnected global impacts. So, for example, Russia's war in Ukraine has reverberated all around the world. The conflict drove up energy and food prices and caused inflation that ignited a global cost of living crisis, resulting in social unrest. This is not only affecting Europe and the Americas, it's also having far-reaching implications for areas far removed from the conflict zone, like the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, where inflationary pressures combined with drought have worsened food insecurity. According to a 2024 edition of the Global Peace Index, the GPI, conflict has steadily increased over the last decade. There are currently 56 conflicts, the most since World War II. A record-setting 92 countries are involved in wars outside of their borders, and almost 100 countries saw a decline in peacefulness in 2024. The Geneva Academy is currently monitoring 110 armed conflicts. In the past year, the level of political violence has increased by 27%, according to the ACLED Conflict Index. They estimate that 1 in 6 people have been exposed to conflict in the first half of 2024. Led by Ukraine, Myanmar, Mexico, and Palestine, 50 countries rank in the index categories for extreme high or turbulent levels of conflict. There are indications that conflicts are worsening. According to ACLED, more nations are getting worse than getting better. In the first 4 months of 2024, 47,000 people died because of global conflicts, putting this year on track to record the highest number of deaths since the Rwandan genocide 30 years ago. The economic cost of conflict amounted to a staggering $19.1 trillion in 2023. Crises contribute to the likelihood of conflict, and these conflicts exacerbate humanitarian, environmental, and economic crises. Conflict sets in motion a self-reinforcing downward spiral where each crisis can amplify the impacts of the other. These entangled crises weaken the government's ability to manage resources and maintain law and order, all of which increase the likelihood of more conflict that perpetuates cascading cycles of environmental destruction and human suffering. According to conflict theory, the struggle for resources is primarily between those on the top who have the power and those on the bottom who do not. Inequality is a serious social and economic problem that effectively illustrates the interrelated dynamics of a polycrisis. Intersectionality refers to the ways that different forms of inequality come together to create a negative compound effect. Researcher Kimberly Crenshaw explains that such intersectionality represents obstacles that are not readily accessible to conventional thinking. Inequality is increasing alongside the destructive impacts we are having on the natural world. The extent of this growing inequality has been described as off the charts. According to Reich, the world's 5 richest men have doubled their wealth since 2020, while 5 billion people have become poorer. Thomas Piketty believes that inequality is perpetuated by our politics, ideology, and institutions. He refers to the inequality that exists in the legal, educational, and fiscal systems as an inequality regime. Such regimes rely on the erroneous belief that when the wealthy prosper, the rest of the economy benefits. But as Robert Reich explained, wealth does not beget more wealth. It begets more power over our economy and our democracy. The evidence reveals the folly of trickle-down economics. As economies grow, gains are going to the tiny minority. The growth we have seen since the recession of 2008 has increased the concentration of wealth and power, while the vast majority of people are experiencing declines in their standards of living. According to the World Inequality Report, the top 10% of the world's population owns more than 3/4, 76%, of the world's wealth. These 10% take in more than half of global incomes, 52%, while the poorest earn just 8.5%. The top 10% account for almost half, 48%, of global carbon emissions, while having 190 times the purchasing power of the poorest half of the global population. The richest 1% are also increasing their share of global income. Medium incomes are stagnant, while the wealthiest 1% has claimed 95% of the post-recession gains. As reported in a BBC article by Luke Kemp, the share of global wealth from the 1% has swelled from 25% in the 1980s to approximately 40% in 2016. Trainer estimates that in 2024, the top 1% own about half of the world's wealth. A recent Oxfam analysis indicates that the richest 1% have amassed $42 trillion in new wealth over the past decade, nearly 34 times more than the entire bottom 50% of the world's population. The 1% have taken 2/3 of all wealth created since 2020, which is twice as much money as the bottom 99% and nearly 24 times more than the average. Oxfam found that rising rates of inequality have a cascade of negative impacts. This includes making efforts to address poverty, climate, and the economy more costly and less effective. In the IMF's Finance and Development magazine, Andrew Stanley concludes global inequalities are in bad shape and mostly do not appear to be getting better. A Bloomberg article cites research that indicates that we can expect to see even greater disparity between rich and poor as the world warms. According to a NASA study, concentrations of wealth, such as we are seeing today, have historically contributed to the collapse of civilizations. As ecological economist John Erickson pointed out, we cannot sustain an economy that serves the wants of the few by forsaking the needs of the many. Rampant inequality not only fuels conflict and increases crises, the concentration of wealth and power also makes it harder for us to transition to more sustainable ways of living. Like conflict and inequality, biophysical threats also interact dynamically. There are 9 planetary boundaries, each of which is critical to sustaining life on Earth. The Planetary Boundaries Framework was first proposed in 2009 by a group of 28 internationally renowned scientists led by Johan Rockström, the former director of the Stockholm Resilience Center. These indicators have been defined as non-negotiable guardrails that delineate planetary preconditions. They represent the limits of the Earth's life system and the basic elements that make our planet habitable. The 9 planetary boundaries are stratosphere ozone depletion, loss of biosphere integrity, chemical pollution and the release of novel entities, climate change, ocean acidification, freshwater consumption in the global hydrological cycle, land system change, nitrogen and phosphorus flows to the biosphere and oceans, and atmospheric aerosol loading. Human activities are transgressing these boundaries and threatening ecological and social collapse. Of the 9 planetary boundaries, 3 were passed as of 2009, 4 as of 2015, and by 2023 that number had climbed to 6. A recent study published in Science Advance reviewed the state of the 9 planetary boundaries. It indicated that we have already breached one of the remaining boundaries, aerosol loading, and another, ocean acidification, is close to being breached. Overall, the authors conclude Earth is now well outside of the safe operating space for humanity. While each of these guardrails is of concern on its own, the combined interaction between these threats are worse than the sum of their parts. As explained by Rockström et al., planetary boundaries are interdependent because transgressing one may both shift the position of the other boundaries or cause them to be transgressed. Transgressing planetary boundaries can have a domino effect that risks triggering irreversible tipping points, which are defined as emergent properties, chaotic behavior, and stochastic events. The term tipping points is derived from physics, and it describes the sudden toppling of a balanced object. Such tipping points are an irreversible deviation from conditions conducive to presently existing life on Earth. Once we pass tipping points, the problem will exceed human agency such that nothing can be done to stop it. We are well on our way to such tipping points. According to a report compiled by the WEF, 1/5 of world leaders said they expect progressive tipping points and persistent crises leading to catastrophic outcomes. Crises and conflict are locked in feedback loops, while global inequality is caught up in a vicious cycle with a range of adverse, interconnected social, economic, political, and environmental impacts. Likewise, the compound effects of biophysical threats increase the likelihood of disaster. Conflict, inequality, and biophysical threats all interact with each other to exacerbate adverse impacts. So, for example, transgressing planetary boundaries has a range of adverse social consequences. This includes the ways that the loss of biosphere integrity, things like climate change and biodiversity loss, contributes to inequality, and vice versa. Similarly, conflict and war adversely intensify biophysical threats, and vice versa. These types of interactions illustrate a few of the ways that crises become entangled. Exploring the interrelationships between these issues has significant implications for our efforts to address the problems. In a recent Manga Bay article, Rockstrom emphasized the seriousness of our predicament while saying, "We also have a tremendous opportunity." These compounding crises are a clarion call for a global sustainability transformation. The insights provided by the Polycrisis framework can help us to generate more efficient solutions while minimizing the adverse consequences associated with our efforts.